everybody. My name's Nolan. Thanks for hanging out for the last session and the last day of the conference. We're going to talk about using web components in cold fusion applications. The obligatory ego slide. I run south of Shasta. We are a developer consultancy. We build web and mobile apps and provide training for a variety of different outfits. About a year ago, I also became VP of Engineering for a tech startup in Sacramento called Emission Control. We are building a SaaS platform to help companies that use gas and diesel equipment that want to go electric and be better for the environment. We help them figure out ways to do that to earn money from the government. I also run a local tech meetup called SAC Interactive. It used to be our Sacramento Cold Fusion group, and now it's more of an all things web and mobile group. I used to program video games for a living until I learned that's a terrible way to make a living. And I'm willing to bet I've been to more concerts than the rest of you combined, and buy more records as well. My house looks like this. I'm quite proud of my record collection. If you don't want to take photos or jot down notes, just take a photo of this one. That's my GitHub repo. That's where all of the slides on all of the code I'm going to show you today is right now. It's all up to date and current. So you can take a photo of that and then leave if you want to, I guess. I'll try not to be offended. I see a couple more phones. All right, we good? Cool. Okay, so to learn web components, a couple things you should know in advance so that all the concepts we're going over here today make sense. You should be familiar with what I'll call modern JavaScript, just some basic OO stuff, like you know what an object and a class is, you know how a constructor works, things like that. You should know a little bit about what inheritance means. You should also be familiar with the DOM, so you know what it means by like adding things to the DOM and removing children from the DOM and stuff of that nature. If you have experience using Cold Fusion custom tags, you might find the syntax for those similar to what we're doing for web components, so knowing how those work will help a little bit as well. And you should know some of the basic stuff like how APIs work and what JSON means, and if we say this is an AJAX style page, you know kind of generally what those concepts involve. So we're going to go over what a web component is in general. I'll show you some basic examples of how to get them started, like a hello world style web component. I'll show you a few more things you can do with them along the way, and then we'll combine web components with a couple different types of Cold Fusion applications, legacy stuff, things that are maybe not full-blown REST APIs, and then some things that are kind of in the middle of those two worlds. And I'll point you towards some other links for more info if you want to go further down the web component path later on. So what is a web component? It's a way to write your own HTML tags. The tags are different from Cold Fusion custom tags because these are client-side rendered, not rendered in your Lucy or Adobe CF server. It's pure JavaScript. And the tags are treated by the browser like first-class citizens. What I mean by that is your browser has baked-in tags like table and div and section that it knows about already. Any tags you write as a web component, the browser treats them with the same level of respect, basically, as table and div and section and things like that. So it'll think they're just a baked-in tag. They require no libraries. These are not things that have to be compiled from TypeScript or React or anything like that. You write them in vanilla JavaScript. It takes very, very little vanilla JavaScript to start writing them. And because it is vanilla JavaScript, they run really fast. So there's no machinery overhead of like a framework or anything being loaded to do web components. Like I said, they are not framework specific. This is not a React thing or a Vue thing or anything like that. It's straight JavaScript. But the nice thing about web components is they work both in traditional websites that have no framework in place. They also work in all of these single-page application frameworks out there. So web components, you could write one today, drop it into a Vue app, it'll just work. Drop it into a React app, it'll just work. Same for Angular and Svelte and whatever framework comes out 6 months from now. They are by design separate from any of those environments. You drop them in. And as far as your React app or your Vue app is concerned, it's another tag I can use, just like div or table or whatever. And of course, they work in CFML applications because it's pure JavaScript. It runs after all your CFML has been processed. So like I mentioned, you should know a little bit about OOP and how the DOM stuff works. You do not need to have anything installed to build web components. There's no Node NPM thing, no TypeScript, no third-party tools, anything like that. And they can connect to your Cold Fusion server. They can also connect to anything else you might happen to have running in your environment. If you've got an old PHP server that still has to do something, you can talk to that. You can talk to a COBOL server if it can send you back JSON. It doesn't matter what the backend is running. It's just JavaScript. Browser support is pretty good. you'll see there's a tiny different color in green for Safari. If you look up that footnote, it basically says there's one bug in one situation with web components that we don't want to fix because there's a pretty decent workaround, so just do the workaround thing. So it's not exactly the same color of green support across all of the browsers, but it's close enough for all day-to-day stuff that you'll be fine. I have never, in a real-world situation, run into the problem with that Safari browser. You just write your web component and go on about your day. So let's take a look at our first one. My demo. Here's my hello world.js file. I've got a few lines of code. I'm making a class called hello world. You can see that it extends a class called HTML element. I'm inheriting from that class that's baked into your browser. I didn't write HTML element. I've got one method called connected callback, and I'm simply saying this.text content is hello and welcome to CFCamp. And then down below the end of that web component, I simply use this custom element define thing. What that tells my browser is this JavaScript class that I've made is going to be referenced by this name on the HTML side of what I'm doing, hello-world, all lowercase letters. And over here in my HTML side, I include that down here. I include that hello world.js file, and I can simply call that web component just like any other HTML tag, table, div section. There's nothing extra happening in the page. And to show you that I'm not lying to you and that actually works, we'll go here and there's your hello and welcome tag. Nothing crazy about that. Let's go back here. First web component. So you notice that the name was hello-world in how I named that tag, but the JavaScript class was hello and capital H and capital W all smushed together. The naming conventions are required to be that way when you build web components. You have to have a dash somewhere in the name of the tag that you make. The reason for that is so that the browsers can tell the difference in web components I make and new tags that might be added to HTML later on. So if I made a tag called treehouse, all one word, and in HTML version 50, they add a treehouse tag. Someone goes to my website, and I'm using the treehouse syntax. The browser's not going to know, do we run Nolan's custom treehouse component or the baked-in one? So to tell the difference in the two, any web components you write on your own, you have to have a dash somewhere in the name of the tag. That's not just me being pedantic with how I like to name things. You just have to do that. That's the rule. They won't work otherwise. Usually what I would do is if you have a suite of these that you're making, maybe for a team or whatever, or a particular project, just come up with a prefix for how you name all of your web components. Like, I don't work for Ortus, but you could do something like box-treehouse and box-UI widget and whatever, and have all of your prefixes for naming them so that you get some value out of having to have those characters in your naming conventions. Let's talk a little bit about the code that you saw over here. Over here, rather. So the connected callback thing, that's the code that tells the browser when someone uses this web component, or rather when it gets added to the DOM, run this chunk of code. This is your starting point, if you will, for this is the thing I want you to do when somebody uses my web component. And then that custom element define thing we had at the bottom, that's the thing that actually registers your web component with the browser and says, there is a new tag now called, in this case, hello world, but it could be treehouse or favorite color or whatever the tag is that you're making. It essentially makes it visible to the rest of the stuff in your website to run. So in addition to that connected callback method we saw, there are a handful of other lifecycle methods that you may or may not want to use while you're doing things. It's a recommended practice to have a constructor in your class. I did not use one in that previous example, just to keep the first demo small and easy to follow. There are a handful of other methods. We were not going to go into the details of what each of them do today. There's just not enough time to show you all of them. But I will tell you the constructor is one we will use in all the future demos. That's technically not required, but if you've been writing CF components before, hopefully you know that writing the init method is a best practice in all of your components. We'll write in a constructor in any OO thing, whether it's Java components or CFCs or whatever else, is just a best practice. So we'll follow the same practice in our web components. Connected callback, as you saw a minute ago, that's a thing that actually runs when your web component starts to do something. So you'll see that in all of the examples that we have today as well, constructor and this guy. You've got a couple others that we'll look at in the middle set of the demos. Observed attributes and attribute change callbacks, and those just let you pass values into your web component and then tell the web browser, you gave me a new value for these attributes. Please do something with them. I'll show you how those work today as well. If you take your web component out of the DOM, you can have an event that runs that says, I am no longer part of this DOM tree. Do something with it. There's another one called adopted callback, where if you have two documents next to each other and you drag your web component from one to the other, this event called adopted callback will run. I have never in my life come up with a real-world use for doing that in an app. The only thing I can find people mentioning online is if you have iframes and you're dragging a web component from one iframe to another. If you are building a site that uses both iframes in 2023 and web components and you're doing this, please find me after the session. I would love to know why that is the design decision you came to. I can't come up with a legit reason for it. So you can pass attributes into them. We saw our hello world example from earlier. Obviously, doing stuff like this is useful in building your web components. We'll take a look at a real quick attribute example. So the HTML is pretty much what you would expect it to be. Same hello world tag as before. I'm passing first name and last name in as attributes. I'm including the same hello world JS style of syntax like we had previously. And here is my code. Couple of new things from the previous demo. Same class extend thing. Now we have a constructor that calls the super constructor from HTML element just to turn the machinery on. I have this new method we mentioned in the previous slides, observed attributes. This is just the name of those attributes that I called over here on the HTML side. First name and last name. First name and last name. That's literally just what you do to tell the web component or tell the browser, this web component is going to accept these attributes if you pass them in. If you have code that runs and sets or changes first name or last name, then this code is going to be what runs and says, yep, I got values for first name and last name. Please assign them to this.first name and this.last name in my web component. So pretty much when you start building web components, you'll copy and paste that chunk of code into whatever your new web component is that you start. Whatever the attributes are that you want to have in your new component, you'll change that array that I have highlighted there. The rest of this you can just copy and paste from component to component, and until you're doing things that are a little bit more involved, they'll stay about the way they are like that. And I've got the same connected callback method we had earlier, and in here I'm just using backticks and the $sign curly bracket syntax to grab those first name and last name properties that were passed in and draw them on the screen. And I'll go over here and run that demo. Where's number 2? There we go. Hello, Nolan Erck. Welcome to CFCamp 2023. So it works how you expect it to work. Multiple instances of a web component. Let's take a look at that real quick. So I'm going to close this down. And here's my hello world component from before. This is an exact copy of the one we just saw. I haven't changed anything. And in my HTML side, I'm simply invoking 4 copies of hello world for John, Paul, George, and Ringo. So that should work how we expect it to. Let's go over here and run that. Oh, no, look, it's not working. Instead of getting the div tags to render to the screen properly, they're being escaped into plain text. I guess there's one tiny difference in this demo down here. So I have divs inside my connected callback. They're not being rendered out as actual div tags on the screen. They're being turned into plain text like this. You can see if I go right-click and inspect it, you'll look at this. It's not showing the divs properly. So what happened there? The problem is actually that div tag I tried to use here in my connected callback. In the previous one, connected callback looks like this, plain text. There's the variables in there, the $sign stuff, but there's no div or paragraph tags or anything. In this version 3 that I have, I tried to add a little bit of HTML into that connected callback, and that's when it went really sideways, right? You cannot actually add HTML tags into that this.text content attribute. You can only add plain text in there. So we need better functionality than this.text content to do that. It might also be nice to have a way to put CSS in our component so I can style those divs and say any div inside my hello world or inside my favorite color web component, whatever the thing is I'm building, it gets, had a certain border or shade of color or whatever to it. To do that, we're going to use a thing called Shadow DOM. So Shadow DOM takes the encapsulation stuff in our web component and solves a few of those problems for us. It basically takes a separate copy of the DOM for our web component outside of what the main browser thing is doing, and lets me manipulate things inside my web component in a little bit more of a safe way than I could do with like this.text content that escaped everything out into the, you saw the angle brackets on the screen for my div tags instead of rendering proper div tags. The way you turn shadow DOM on and off is you do this.attach shadow in your web component. It's got two ways to use it, open or closed, and that basically means if it's open, then JavaScript in other files in your site can manipulate your web component from the outside. And if you say it's closed, then it's basically like a closed CF component with everything private. You can't actually change the component from the outside. They both have their place. It just depends on what you're doing with your application. And the way that works is like so. Let's go back here and take a look at our shadow DOM. So the HTML is exactly the same. I don't have to do anything different over here. And in the JavaScript, a lot of it's the same. Constructor and all the top part is the same. Reserved, these two guys for your attributes are identical. In connected callback, we've gotten a little bit fancier here. So the first thing I did was called this attach shadow and said make this a closed component, please. So nothing on the outside can manipulate my hello world component. Save that to a variable called shadow. And then in shadow.innerHTML, I have a style block, and I have a div tag now, as opposed to the plain text that we had 2 demos prior. So now let's run this one and see what happens before shadow DOM. And now I get my divs to render on the screen properly like I expect them to. In fact, if I go inspect element, we kind of saw this a minute ago, but I didn't delve into it too much. If I expand out the body of my browser debug window, you can see down at the bottom there, it's actually rendering hello-world tags just like it would render paragraph or div tags or whatever. I can click into those, expand out the hello world tag, and you can see a thing called shadow root inside there. And if I expand out inside that, now it will show me my style block, and it will show me the div tag that I have inside my web component. But as far as the browser is concerned, it's rendering hello world tags, and then the hello world tag knows how to render the div and the style stuff inside it, and then it all just gets populated up and runs. Yes, sir? What is the, oh, the hosting? Oh, so I'll show you what the hosting does next. You're talking about this guy right here? So what that's for is, since I'm in a component called hello world, the HTML wouldn't know what to do really if I went hello world. If I could spell, that would help. So what you do inside a web component is you say host, and that just means style this component here. It's sort of like the this operator in other contexts. It's host is style this thing that I'm rendering right now. So my hello world component. Does that help? Yeah, you could do host and then style, yeah, host space p to style a paragraph inside it, or host space div to style my div a certain way. And yeah, and if you have a web component that has a div and a paragraph and a table and 9 image tags, you can do all the same CSS selector stuff that you would do with. Yes, styles can be on the outside, and you can link in a file if you want to do it that way as well. If you use like view components and things like that, or Angular components, you'll find what some people do is they'll build a component and they'll have like the style section and the business logic section and the layout in the component itself. And so I'm just kind of following the same idea here to show that you can put all this stuff in one spot if you want to. But yeah, you can link out to a CSS file if you need to. Say that again, I'm sorry? Yes, if you do the host : thing, that makes it more specific to this thing that you're in. The web component CSS will override the global CSS file that you have. Right. Yeah, so there's our shadow, and we do shadow inner HTML. Now we have this stuff. We get our divs rendered on the screen, and you can see there's your shadow root, and we have a separate one for each instance of our hello world with all these specific stuff passed into it. John Lennon, George Harrison, and so on. Slots. So far we've had open and closed tags that look like this. Right? Just open hello world, nothing inside it, close hello world. In real applications, you often want to do things like that. Open, tag, put some stuff in between, and then close tag on the other side. To do that in web components, use a concept called slots. It's not as weird as it sounds. It's just you put a placeholder in between for the thing you're doing. Slots work like this. Close 4, 5. So there's my hello world with Pete Best in the middle. We had Beatles in the last example. Does anyone know who Pete Best is? A couple people? He was the original drummer of the Beatles before Ringo started. If I had South of Shasta t-shirts with me today, I'd throw one at you right now, yeah. The rumor is that Pete Best was better looking than Paul or John. So after their club shows, girls were hanging out with Pete instead of Paul or John. So they fired Pete and hired Ringo to solve that problem. You get free music trivia at my demos at no extra charge. All right, so the slot version, pretty similar to what we saw earlier. My constructor is all the same. My attribute stuff is all copy and pasted. Most of what we have in here is exactly the same: attached shadow, host, blah, blah, blah. That's the only difference, is I have this tag in there called slot, where the thing in between your open and closed web component tags goes. You can see it says hello, slot, slot, and welcome to CFCamp. Hello, Pete Best. That's demo number 5. Let's go back there and watch this guy. Hello, Pete Best, and welcome to CFCamp. So you can pass your content in just like you would any other HTML tag, because as far as the browser is concerned, it is any other HTML tag. Yeah, can I inspect that? Yep. Right component, inspect. Ben's trying to catch me in a lie over here. Yeah, shadow DOM, and there's your content. It looks just like any other table or div or whatever would. I promise there's no smoke and mirrors. It's all working exactly the way I'm explaining it. Yes? Can I go over the constructor with the constructor? Sure. Oh, sure. So this hello world tag takes 2 attributes in, right? Oh, I guess that you're right. This one, that's just a copy and paste from the previous slide. Because it didn't set a last name default value, and it'll default to an empty string. Yeah. Yeah, that's the constructor, so I'm just using that to set defaults for different things if I want to. But you don't have to, because it's JavaScript. It'll just blank it out. All right, so let's look at some slightly more real-world examples of what you can do with web components. How many times have you built an app with a delete something button, and you have to make a little pop-up show up first saying, do you really want to delete that? And then you have to write that if confirm is true, do one thing, and if confirm is false, do the other thing, and you're always writing that version of JavaScript and copy and pasting it 50 billion times in your application, and you're bored silly from doing that? Let's write a component that does that. So here, I have confirm button, and it takes a URL in, point to my success CFM page, and I just have the text in there, delete file. And confirm button looks like this. Confirm button extends HTML element. Here's my constructor. A little bit more involved than the last one. I'm simply turning the shadow DOM on up here, wrapping it with a button tag. So here's my slot. So right here we have delete file is the text being passed in between the open and closed tags. So that will become delete file, and this is just getting added, we're wrapping the button around it. So it'll be button, delete file, close button. The only attribute I care about is called confirm URL. And here we have, when this item gets connected to the DOM, we're going to add a click listener like you would any other JavaScript. So when this confirm button is clicked, run a method called doConfirmClick, which I have down here. And there's where your generic JavaScript that you copy and paste over and over again lives. Are you sure you want to do that thing? Yes. Do that, otherwise return false. And then I'm making a confirm-button tag. That is number 6. There's my delete file button. It's kind of tiny. Are you sure you want to proceed? No, and it just bounces me right back to where I was at. Are you sure you want to proceed? Yes, and it goes forward to the URL that I gave it to go do something else. Obviously, you'd probably want to have a nice pretty modal in your branded application, but to keep the demos easy to follow, I went with the generic confirm button for this one. Yes? Any limitation what you can do in the constructor versus in the connected callback. Not that I've run into. Maybe if you got fancier with it, there would be. Or if you're worried about like rendering speed of stuff, there might be some differences in that. But I haven't run anything with the stuff that I've built yet, no. All right, let's go to slideshow. Who's got jQuery slideshows installed on their application from like 2007 and you're just stuck with it because that's what you installed and nobody's ever changed anything? Yeah. So you probably installed jQuery to get that running, and then at least one slideshow.js file and probably a slideshow.css file, all three of which are meant to be super flexible for everyone on the planet, and they're way too heavy for what you actually need them to do in your site. So you're paying this download cost every time somebody goes to that site and does something with it. Here's my slideshow app. I have a slideshow tag, and I passed in 5 images. And my slideshow looks like this. It's one file with 92 lines of stuff and pretty liberal amounts of white space in there, too. Full disclosure, I nicked this from a demo Ray Camden wrote a little while ago, and I modified it to be a slideshow instead of, I think it had a cat thing, probably. Constructor similar to what we had before. I'm simply building out some image tags, wrapping this previous button and next button stuff technically below the slot in this case. So I'm going to have my image up top, and then I'll have previous and forward and back buttons below it with a little bit of metadata, if you will, showing which photo I'm on out of how many total photos there are. Wiring up my buttons. So here's the things called previous and next button. Save some variables to reference those later on. And then down in my connected callback, I simply say, if you click that next button, run the next image function down below. If you click my previous button, run the previous button code down below, and so on. And I have a thing called update image. There's not a whole lot going on in these. Next image and previous image is a little bit of array math to move forward and back in your array, or depending on what photo you're on. And update image simply does style display block or style display none, depending on which photo I want to look at any given time. You can walk through the array math later if you want to. And slideshow works the way we expect it to from our earlier demo. Go in here. Not that one, that one. Slideshow's right here. Make that a little smaller so I can see the buttons. And there it just flips through and does my little slideshow. And it took way less code than jQuery plus whatever jQuery photo album thing you downloaded to do. And it works just fine. It is if I tell the shadow DOM attach and make it closed, or not, yeah. All right, now let's talk to a Cold Fusion server and see how this stuff works. You can, of course, mix and match this with any combination of CFML stuff you have and plain JavaScript stuff on the front end. You don't have to rewrite your entire code base to take advantage of this. This isn't like a cold box only thing or a RESTful API only thing. The more modern your code is, the easier it will be to do some of the stuff, just because it'll be easier to get an API out to your customers, or out to the front end. But you don't have to do anything too crazy to make it work with Cold Fusion. So go in here and we'll take a look at how some of this goes. CFML variables. Now I have an index CFM file. We haven't had one of those yet. Those were all HTML files from before. And here I have a component called guitarplayer.js. So I have a Cold Fusion array, a struct with just some stuff in it. This could be users in your system or students at your school. I'm a music nerd, so they are guitar players. Here I simply have CF loop over that array. And then inside my loop, I'm rendering out the guitar player web components one by one. And those work how you expect them to work. Get over here, 8. And then they go, and it rendered out this component with name and the photo, and there's all 5 of them down below. I didn't have to do anything crazy. I can just include the JS file and use my web component right smack dab in the middle of some Cold Fusion stuff. So that works okay. None of our code actually cares if your backend is Cold Fusion. It can be PHP, it can be .NET, it can be anything that can send JSON out to the front end will work with a web component. Just like we have here. So here I've got, in this case I have a guitar players, plural, web component that I made. It does things a little bit differently. Let's take a look at this one. I simply have a line of JavaScript in here using the fetch API. Go out to my musicians CFC. I'm going to start with this one actually and go with, I have a legacy Cold Fusion CFM file. No components even being used anywhere. So if you're still stuck in 1999 land for legacy reasons. I'm sorry, but you are still able to take care of some of this stuff, or take advantage of some of this stuff in your app too. I can make my variable just like before, and then you simply have to do something along these lines to get your output out there, right? Reset the output buffer, take that variable from up above, serialize it to JSON, and now when I go to that URL, I would actually get, let's copy this one over here, API legacy. I'll get JSON out the other side like I expect it to. So I can connect that here in my demo. And it outputs the names of the people just like I expect it to. No CFCs needed anywhere, no cold box, no taffy, nothing. If I have a CFC, but we're not quite full-blown API RESTful or anything like that, you can actually connect to a method in a CFC simply by going to the URL where that CFC lives. I'll show you what I mean by that. If I go here, I have a component musician.cfc. I've got a method in here called getGuitarists. Notice that it's set not to public or private, but set to remote. That's the magic thing you got to do to make this work. Make it remote. I've got my Cold Fusion in here. It simply returns that variable back out to the front end. So now if I go here to my API, I can go API/musicians.cfc, method equals getGuitarists, and it outputs all that stuff. There's my XML version of that stuff straight to the screen. I will call that method from the browser and make it do something. But that's not JSON. One other thing you can do is you can actually pass in, it's really hard to see, I'm sorry, but I can pass in the URL attribute return format equals JSON, and now it magically turns my code into JSON. I didn't have to write any code. I didn't have to go into the CFC and say deserialize JSON thing. You add that URL parameter to the end of the URL that points to your CF component method. Cold Fusion does the rest. Lucy works the same way. So I can go into my guitar player's web component, turn off the legacy Cold Fusion CFM file, and do that exact same thing here in my code, musician.cfc, method equals getGuitarists, and return format equals JSON. And that will work the exact same way here. Now I'm getting back the data from the other file. Notice how my component actually has an optional attribute called genre. I can pass in genre and then filter down, get the metal bands or the punk bands or whatever out of here. Same concept. I can go into my JavaScript. Well, first I'll go to the browser side. Here, let's go this way. I can go and genre equals punk, and now filter down to just the bands that have punk in the attribute for it. And I can take that same URL and do that same concept here in my JavaScript. Genre equals punk, save this one, and now I get just the punk bands back from the thing with barely not having to write any real custom functionality anywhere, just pass the URL parameter in, and away we go. If you're doing this, obviously it works with Coldbox, with Taffy, with anything else you have an API that generates stuff. Plug in whatever your URL looks like here, and it'll work the exact same way. You don't have to do anything special for Framework 1 or for Coldbox or whatever else. The more modern your code is, the easier it is, but that's all you got to do. All right, other ways to get JSON back from the server. Actually, we did that demo already. Here we go. If you're also stuck in a really old situation, you can also do things like this, where you just do CF/HTTP off to your legacy CFM file and return the results that way. And that will work. And then you can see down here, I'm just looping over the singular guitar player web component and passing the attributes in as I need to and getting them to render out this way. That's demo 10. Let's take a look at this guy. And there I got the data back from my legacy file. It's the same CFM file that we used in the previous demo. I haven't changed anything. And now I can turn that URL, CF/HTTP URL off, and uncomment this one. And I'm doing the same trick with CF/HTTP here that we did in the previous demo. I'm going straight to the CFC, method equals getGuitarist, and return format equals JSON. Is there anything else on the end of that? Nope, just there. So now if I run that URL, I get all the stuff back that I expect. And I can do CF/HTTP. And I can pass that filter onto the end of here, just like I expect it to as well. I'll go genre equals metal, save, reload that. And now I get back that stuff. So this kind of technique is helpful if you're in like a legacy kind of situation. You can do all your CFHTTP calls like at the top of your file or something, or try to separate them out from your legacy code as much as possible. I realize we're not all in the spot where we can rewrite an application from scratch just to solve legacy issues and what have you. But at least here I've got like the machinery in my HTML file all physically at the top, and then I've got the output starting down here. And technically I have some CFML here, but it's just rendering stuff. I don't have the CFHTTP calls in the middle of my body tags or anything. They're all up at the top in kind of a separate situation. So these are also useful for like migrations things. If you are on a legacy application and you want to move off of jQuery because it's not 2003 anymore and you want to do something a little more modern, but you can't hit the nuclear button and delete your entire app and start from scratch, you can do things like turn the business logic that you have in various jQuery plugins or various old chunks of JavaScript, turn them into self-contained web components, because you're just going to write them in straight JavaScript, no Vue or Angular or TypeScript required, and then you can just kind of drop those in one by one, slowly move your site over to web components, pull out the jQuery slideshow, pull out the jQuery favorite color and the whatever else, get rid of all those dependencies on your site. You'll probably speed everything up in the process, and you'll get rid of a whole bunch of, I'm going to guess, jQuery plugins that are not supported anymore by whoever wrote them 15 years ago. And once you get things into web components like that, you could leave it there and it would work. It's just vanilla JavaScript. Or you could use that as a migration path to move towards building a pure JavaScript front end. If you want to write everything in React or Vue, well, once it's in web components, those just work in React and Vue. You just copy and paste them into your repo for the new mobile app running React Native or whatever. You don't have to change anything. So it's a really good kind of way off of legacy JavaScript. You can leave it there if you want in just web component land, or you can use it in combinations with any of the JavaScript frameworks. They are 100% compatible with all the JavaScript frameworks by design. So you don't have to worry about, we're using Vue now, but we might want to go to React. Do we have to rewrite our web components? Nope. Copy, paste, you're done. And as we saw, they work with your CF components and your APIs and your CFM legacy files. There's very little syntax to deal with them. We saw the constructor stuff. We've got that custom element method you call where you say, here's my class name, here's the hyphenated tag name I want to reference it by in my browser. There's not a whole heck of a lot else you have to do with them. I'm not hiding 50 JS files that I included or anything. It's literally this simple. You make a JS file, add 15 or so lines of stuff, and you're pretty much ready to go with them. You can integrate them with other libraries if you want to try to use a web component with a jQuery plugin of some kind, or some other JavaScript library that whoever wrote, and you want to try to use them both together. They're just JavaScript, so they should, in theory, work. Your mileage may vary on that. It will just depend on how well your web component is written and how well that other third-party library was written too. But if everyone's following good practices, they should be fine. One thing you might have noticed in my demos is all of my tags, hello-world or guitar-player, were lowercase letters. They currently have to be all lowercase letters. There's a bug in the spec that says if you try to use mixed case or uppercase, it just won't actually do anything with your tag. It'll throw it out. So keep them all lowercase for now. That's eventually going to get fixed. Let's see here. What else can I tell you about this? Like I mentioned before, pick a naming convention for your tags, since you have to have that hyphenate somewhere in there. I run south of Shasta, so my tags might be like Shasta-button or Shasta-checkbox or whatever, or SOS button or SOS checkbox. Something to take advantage of the hyphen that you have to use in your naming convention. You might notice that I skipped over form elements. I didn't do input boxes or checkboxes. They can be a little bit trickier to implement just because of when those happen in DOM land. They're a little bit more involved to deal with. If you want to look at how to do form data stuff or form elements, check out the thing called the form data interface. It's just the next level of what to do with web components if you want to add input boxes and checkboxes and things. Ray Camden's got a new blog post from 2 weeks ago that talks about how to do some of that stuff in a clean way too, so check out Ray's blog. If you have sites that you're worried about SEO, don't use these. Google doesn't know what a favorite color or hello world or guitar player tag does. It's not going to know how to rank my guitar player tag in relation to a section or div or whatever. So use this for your fancy UX app parts of the site, but things that are content, leave them in the plain content tags you're already using so that Google knows how to index your stuff properly and go for like that kind of thing. Don't replace everything on your site with web components just because you can. Yes, sir? What about accessibility? Same concept. So like, just like any other JavaScript, keep accessibility in mind when you're doing something. So if you write code that works with on mouse over, make sure that it also works with whatever the laser pointer equivalent of on mouse over is and that sort of thing.
But I mean, is the fact that you have your own names in the text, like with SEO, that doesn't recognize it? Does that also mean that for accessibility, do you have any idea how a screen reader for a visually impaired user will?
It depends on how well the screen readers render it, depends on how the screen reader in question renders content. If you're really concerned about that, but you have a spot where you want to use a web component for something, I would test it with the screen reader, because I just do not put that. Yes, sir?
Kind of piggybacking on that, so you show listening to changes on attributes on the way in.
Mm-hmm.
You want it to, for example, attach an ARIA role. Can you set that internally and have it show up on the host element, or can you only do that because you're listening?
Yes, you can. So the listener that runs when the attributes come in also runs when the attributes change, and leaving, an attribute going away would run that same function. So you just put an if statement in there saying if the ARIA role did something, then I don't know, whatever. It'll show up in the shadow DOM for the thing inside it. If you want it to show up for the parent tag, that's a good question. That I don't know. I'll have to look into that. But it'll add it to the divs and paragraph stuff inside it for sure, though. Yes, Seth?
Other sort of circumstances, it might just fail to render, and do you have a sort of a minimum thing that you might include in the tag that will render anyway, fallbacks, things like that?
Are there situations where this would fail to render? Yes, if you're on like IE7, it will fail to render. Most browsers would treat it the same way as if you had a table tag, but you misspelled the word table. It just defaults to like span or div or something. When it's a tag it doesn't know what to do with, it'll just do the same thing. It'll treat it like a plain text kind of tag. Yeah, probably like in your global CSS file, put in like a, if the shadow DOM has a paragraph tag, then in your global CSS put a paragraph style and do that. Was there another hand up? Yes, sir. If you don't want them to be public, like you don't want. Uh-huh. Well, it's JavaScript, so it's going to be as accessible as any other JavaScript thing is. So if they can log in and do view source and swipe your JS files, they're going to be able to log in and swipe this one too. Oh, it's like if I hit the API and I give the data back. So you would handle the security for that on your API side. Just like have that thing check, who's getting. Just the same best practices for APIs. There's nothing specific to web components. Locking those down, however. Yes, sir? The difference in Shadow DOM closed or open is if it's open, then if I have other JavaScript files in my app, they can manipulate stuff inside my web component. If it's closed, they won't be able to see that web component and do things with it. Yeah, it wouldn't, like if I had my web component called favorite color, and I have some other JavaScript file that does a query selector to say, go select the favorite color element and do something with it, that JavaScript file would get an error saying I can't find that element, is essentially what happens. Yes, you need the Shadow DOM to render HTML in your web component. I mean, there might be some other hack to do it or some other way, but all the docs I've seen is you do it with the Shadow DOM way, and that's kind of the recommended practice. Cool? We good? All right, a couple more slides. Tips, of course, keep your JavaScript organized. That's a good practice no matter what you're doing. I would usually do something like, if I have 5 components, make 5 JS files to keep them all separate, and then my favorite color component goes in favoritecolor.js. My guitar player component goes in guitarplayer.js. Yes, that can mean lots of files if you have lots of web components. You can just use a bundler like Webpack or Rollup or something and smush them all together into one minified file, so you don't have to pay a lot of download penalties when running them. And then, of course, put your JS files at the bottom of your file of your HTML page, not in the head. They'll run faster that way, too. I mentioned Ray Camden's blog. That's a great resource to learn more about web components. He's got a bunch of articles up there. Ben Farrell is a guy that works at Adobe, and he has an up-and-coming YouTube channel called Web Components in Space that he talks about a lot of this stuff. Corbin is a friend of mine back in Sacramento that runs a great JavaScript blog where he talks about web components and Vue and React and all kinds of fun stuff. Unicorn Utterances is awesome. Custom Elements Everywhere are the people that are literally writing tests to make sure that the web component spec stays compatible with Vue and Angular and React and Svelte and all the stuff. So anytime there's a new web component thing, these people write new tests to test that thing, and then they yell at the React or the Vue folks and go, you broke this part, you have to go fix that, and they keep track of all that stuff, which is nice. If you like this, I'm going to look at more things to do with it and get fancier with web components. The Lit framework is really popular. People like that one a lot, and Stencil.js is another one that folks like. Full disclosure, the stuff I showed you today is vanilla JavaScript. Lit and Stencil have a compile build step involved in them. So they're not just as easy as dropping a guitar player JS file like what I showed you here. These have to be built like TypeScript would. And there's a bazillion demos people have built on GitHub. You can just go there and look for different things people have made as well. I'm out of time, so I'm going to skip that. That's how to get a hold of me if you have other questions. We're technically over time, but if someone has a quick one, I'll answer it. And then there are closing remarks in the other room that we got to go head out to after this is done. We good? Thanks very much for listening. See you next year.